Welcome to the debate. We are diving into one of the most persistent puzzles in behavioral science, why our best intentions, especially those crystallized in the annual New Year's resolution, so often just crumble by February. Our source material today explores a really revolutionary shift in strategy, moving away from relying on sheer brute willpower and the often rigid structure of traditional goal-setting frameworks like SMART. Instead, the focus is on more counterintuitive strategies that are designed for long-term consistency.
And the core intellectual tension that's emerging from all this research is, well, identifying the true source of leverage. If we acknowledge that willpower is finite and, frankly, unreliable, where do we actually need to intervene? Is the fundamental key to lasting success found in mastering our internal expectations and our psychological frameworks, which is your position, by, say, accepting failure and prioritizing the system over the outcome?
Right.
Or is the most potent and reliable lever the establishment of powerful external accountability structures and environmental controls, which is my position, that utilize tangible consequences to bind us to our intentions?
I'm going to argue that the primary failure point is cognitive, which means the solution has to be psychological first. We have to fundamentally change the way we approach effort and failure, prioritizing the small, consistent start, and, really, falling in love with the daily process itself.
And I will argue that even the most optimized internal mindset is fragile. It's subject to emotional volatility. The research confirms that external forces, things like binding contracts and environmental design, they provide the necessary structural reinforcement to ensure that consistency continues long after that initial internal enthusiasm has evaporated.
So, the failure of most resolutions, I think, stems from what I'd call aspirational overkill. We set these goals that they're simply too big, which inevitably triggers the silent killer, perfectionism. The source material is compelling in showing that the only way out is through the power of the small. This means abandoning the huge scale required by traditional frameworks and starting with actions that are so tiny they genuinely feel, well, silly. Think about it. Do one push-up after I brush my teeth, or write one sentence before I check email. This strategy, it intentionally bypasses the need for high motivation. A consistent, almost effortless win, even just one push-up, builds a crucial habit foundation. And as the research indicates, that small, consistent action is infinitely more valuable than a huge, short-lived surge of effort. It's really about building a behavioral identity before you start demanding high output.
Okay, I see that. I see the value in that. But I come at it from a completely different angle. The efficacy of the small start is, I think, undeniable for initiation. But relying on that fragile internal motivation, even the little dopamine hit from a small win, that's why goals stall when they try to scale. Behavior modification, it requires leveraging powerful immutable forces, and, internal satisfaction just doesn't compete with external consequence. This brings us to the necessity of the commitment contract.
Right.
Simply telling a friend you want to run a marathon is a nice gesture. It is not accountability. True leverage requires a specific, written agreement that details tangible consequences for failure. For instance, you commit to paying $50 to a charity you despise if you miss your goal 3 days in a row.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty aggressive intervention.
Well, it'd have to be aggressive because it leverages loss aversion, which is a far stronger psychological driver than the potential gain of an achievement. This external structure provides that necessary social pressure, that tangible consequence, and it transforms a vague, private desire into a public, binding agreement. The contract ensures that when you wake up tired and unmotivated, the cost of not doing the action outweighs the effort required to do it.
I see why you emphasize that leverage, but the contract structure, it introduces a risk. It risks reinforcing the very idea of failure as a disaster, which is exactly what we're trying to mitigate. And that's why the second critical internal shift detailed in the material is the 50% rule. The problem isn't usually the inability to start, it's the inability to restart after a slip. Perfectionism dictates that if you miss one day, the entire resolution is just ruined.
The all-or-nothing trap. Yeah.
Precisely. The 50% rule, so resolving to stick to the goal at least half the time, is a deliberate psychological shield. It turns slips into data points, not disasters, and that ensures the goal setter stays in the game. This mindset is absolutely essential because consistency is built on resilience, not on flawless execution.
I'll grant you that the 50% rule is a brilliant cognitive reframe for reducing guilt, but I would argue that its utility is primarily reactive. It helps you recover after the slip. I'm focused on the structural tools that are proactive, the mechanisms that prevent the slip from occurring in the first place, or at least they greatly reduce the probability. Mindset alone won't consistently overcome the friction of starting when fatigue hits.
But that friction is minimized if the final element is in place. The focus has to be entirely on the daily system rather than the distant outcome. If my system is prepare all my meals on Sunday, that is 100% controllable. The outcome, losing 10 pounds, is not. That depends on metabolism, exercise, countless external factors. By defining success as executing the system, we gain control. And as the material states, the desired outcome becomes the inevitable byproduct.
That's a compelling argument regarding systems, but I have to challenge the idea that just focusing on the abstract system is sufficient for reliable execution. Systems need a physical, concrete trigger, and this is where location anchoring proves itself as the most reliable lever. The material is very explicit on this. The environment is often a stronger driver of behavior than internal motivation or even high-level conceptual systems. Location anchoring harnesses this power. By creating a physical cue, as soon as I sit down at my desk, I will start my focused writing. We leverage the brain's procedural memory. The physical place anticipates the action, embedding the habit into the reality of the daily routine. So the environment becomes the constant, reliable force, ensuring that the system you've conceptually designed actually gets executed, without having to mentally debate it every single time.
Okay, but let's go back to the commitment contract for a second. I see why you think it's the necessary external leverage, but I really have to challenge the idea that we can safely introduce that level of external pressure before we address the internal psychological barrier of perfectionism. If we implement a high-stakes commitment contract too early, we're just raising the stakes on an already shaky psychological foundation. The moment the goal is missed, the resulting financial or social cost reinforces the idea of failure as a catastrophe. The research is clear. The most successful goal setters are those who view slips as data. The contract, by making the consequence so tangible and painful, it undermines this resilience. We have to first establish that small, consistent progress is acceptable, and the 50% rule provides that necessary psychological safety net.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the 50% rule in isolation is a sufficient mechanism for driving behavior forward in those moments of low motivation. It's excellent for analysis, yes, and for reducing self-blame, I'll give you that. But the commitment contract is a pre-commitment strategy. It's designed to engineer motivation when it is absent. It operates on the principle that avoiding pain, losing $50, is generally a much stronger driver than achieving pleasure, getting slightly closer to the goal. We use the contract not to punish failure, but to make the cost of an action momentarily higher than the effort of the action. This binding agreement forces the necessary choice on a tired Tuesday morning, relying purely on a gentle internal reminder that it's okay to only do 50% simply is not a strong enough fail-safe for complex or substantial goals.
But the necessity of the contract implies the goal is already large enough to require an external, punitive measure. The core insight of this resolution revolution is to make the goal so tiny that external motivation is redundant, at least for the initial period of automaticity. If I only need to do one push-up, I don't need to fear losing $50. Once automaticity is achieved through those small steps, scaling becomes a manageable design problem, not a motivation crisis.
But that's exactly the transitional challenge. The failure point of resolutions isn't usually the first week of one push-up, it's weeks 4 through 6, when the habit is supposed to transition from novelty to routine, and then internal enthusiasm is just gone. That's when we need external structures to force the choice. A tiny habit is easily abandoned because the consequence for missing it is zero. The commitment contract ensures that the effort stacks onto that tiny foundation, forcing the goal to graduate from silly to substantial.
Let's shift our focus to execution mechanics. You emphasize the systemic focus, that the process is paramount. But systems are just abstract concepts until they are physically anchored. I have to challenge the idea that merely focusing on the system provides 100% controllability.
Location anchoring is the concrete, physical technique that bridges that gap between the conceptual system and daily reality.
Behavioral science shows us that environment cues are extraordinarily powerful, and they bypass high-level conscious decision-making. By anchoring, the brain learns to anticipate the action immediately upon reaching the specified location. The location is the reliable component that guarantees the system is followed. If your system is meditate daily, the anchor is when I sit on the blue cushion. The system is the why, but the anchor is the non-negotiable when and where.
That's an interesting point. And look, I acknowledge location anchoring is a valuable tactical tool. It is. However, it still rests on the conceptual foundation that the system is the true priority. Without that fundamental internal shift, that the process is the goal and the outcome is merely the inevitable byproduct, one might use location anchoring to cue the wrong behavior entirely. For example, if I anchor my desk to check stock prices constantly because I'm obsessed with the outcome, the cue is perfect, but the underlying system is flawed. The initial cognitive clarity, that decision to prioritize a controllable process over an uncontrollable outcome, it has to precede the execution tactic. We have to understand the revolution of system thinking before we can efficiently anchor it. That conceptual shift has to be foundational, otherwise the anchor just triggers the wrong priority with very high reliability.
I would counter that location anchoring is inherently a structural component of the system design, not just some tactic you apply to it. The system isn't just a set of ideas. It's a set of steps performed in a specific context. You cannot have a reliable, robust system without leveraging the constant power of the environment. If the brain is naturally predisposed to respond to environmental cues, which the material asserts, then the highest priority has to be engineering that environment to make the desired behavior the easiest, most obvious choice. The internal mindset is variable. The physical environment is constant, and therefore it is structurally superior as a driver of consistency.
My position holds that the counterintuitive approach of starting small is the singular most effective foundation. It's effective because it builds automaticity quickly, bypassing the need for motivation entirely. It fundamentally changes the required level of psychological investment from high effort, high risk of failure, to low effort, high probability of success. It's an investment in your behavioral identity. I am the person who does this small thing every single day.
And I maintain that while small is necessary for identity building and initiation, it is insufficient for maintenance and scaling into a life-changing resolution. The material still refers to the traditional SMART framework as solid for providing clarity. The external structures, the contracts, and the location anchors are what allow that small habit to grow into a resolution that is specific, measurable, and time-bound. Consider the scaling problem. The contract makes the tiny habit specific about consequences, measurable against a deadline, and it provides the enforcement mechanism needed to bridge that gap between silly, one push-up, and substantial, like a full workout routine. Without that external structure, the individual has to rely on self-generated motivation to push past the initial phase. And that is precisely where most resolutions meet their demise.
Ultimately, my perspective emphasizes that foundational internal shift. We have to forget the vague promises, embrace the minuscule start, and crucially, fall in love with the daily process. When we master these internal elements, managing expectations through the 50% rule and minimizing effort through tiny habits, we fundamentally rewire our relationship with effort and failure. This allows us to become the person who achieves them, which is a far more durable solution than any contract.
And my position remains that while mindset is a crucial factor, relying on robust external mechanisms provides the critical non-negotiable leverage. Commitment contracts and tangible location anchors, they operate regardless of whether we have fallen in love with the process that day. They ensure consistency when the internal factors, motivation, enthusiasm, and focus, inevitably fluctuate or just decline. When you're designing for the long term, structure beats relying purely on psychological resilience every single time.
You know, it seems clear that the source material doesn't mandate an either-or choice here. It presents multiple science-backed strategies that work by targeting different points in the habit formation cycle.
The true resolution revolution may indeed necessitate a synergistic combination, addressing the psychological barriers internally while leveraging powerful external structures for consistency and scale.
Agreed. The intellectual challenge really lies in prioritizing the levers. Should we lead with psychological protection to prevent the catastrophic failure that's inherent in perfectionism? Or should we lead with binding external enforcement to ensure necessary action is taken even on the bad days? The material gives us the tools to analyze both of those priorities.
A perfect point to leave the listener to weigh the evidence for themselves and perhaps design their own hybrid strategy for lasting change.